I never thought my own son would let his wife humiliate me in front of 40 strangers. But standing on their front porch with the door slammed in my face, I realized I had been blind to who Stephanie really was. The sound of laughter echoing from inside their new house felt like knives in my chest. But what they didn't know was that I held something in my purse that would change everything. The mortgage papers I had co-signed were about to become my weapon of choice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Richardson, and at 58 years old, I thought I had learned to read people pretty well. 25 years of teaching high school English had given me plenty of practice spotting deception and manipulation. Yet somehow, I had completely missed the signs with my daughter-in-law, Stephanie. Perhaps it was because I wanted so desperately to love the woman my son David had chosen. Perhaps it was because losing my husband Frank to cancer 3 years ago had left me vulnerable and grateful for any family connection. Whatever the reason, I had been walking around with blinders on for the past 2 years, and today they had been violently ripped away. The morning had started like any other Saturday in October. The autumn leaves were painting Portland in brilliant reds and golds, and I was excited about attending David and Stephanie's housewarming party. They had been planning this celebration for weeks, ever since moving into their beautiful new colonial home in the Laurelhurst neighborhood. When David had asked me to co-sign the mortgage 6 months earlier, explaining that his credit wasn't quite strong enough on its own, I hadn't hesitated. Frank and I had always planned to help our children achieve their dreams, and even though Frank wasn't here to see it, I knew he would have wanted me to make David's homeownership possible. I had spent Friday evening carefully selecting my outfit for the party, settling on a navy blue dress that Frank had always complimented me on, paired with the pearl earrings David had given me for my last birthday. I wanted to look nice for their friends and neighbors to represent David's family well. Stephanie had mentioned that several of her colleagues from the marketing firm would be attending, along with neighbors and some college friends. I was looking forward to meeting the people who were becoming part of my son's new community. The house was stunning when I pulled into the driveway at exactly 2 o'clock, the time Stephanie had specified in her text message. The white columns and black shutters gave it a classic elegance, and the front garden was already beautifully landscaped with mums and ornamental cabbage and autumn colors. David's black BMW sat in the driveway next to Stephanie's silver Mercedes, both cars representing the successful lifestyle they had built together. At 32, David was a software engineer for a tech company downtown, while Stephanie worked in marketing for a boutique firm in the Pearl District. They were the picture of young professional success. I gathered the housewarming gifts from my car, a set of Italian ceramic serving bowls I had found at a local artisan shop, along with a bottle of champagne to celebrate their new home. The sounds of conversation and laughter drifted from the backyard, suggesting the party was already in full swing. I walked up the stone pathway, admiring the way the afternoon sun highlighted the autumn decorations Stephanie had arranged on the front porch. When I rang the doorbell, it was Stephanie who answered, looking absolutely radiant in a burgundy sweater dress that complemented her auburn hair perfectly. She had always been beautiful, with the kind of polished appearance that came from careful attention to style and fitness. At 29, she had the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. "Eleanor," she said, but something in her tone immediately put me on alert. There was no warmth in her voice, no smile on her face. "You're here." "Of course I'm here," I replied, holding up the gifts. "I wouldn't miss David's housewarming party. The house looks absolutely beautiful." Stephanie glanced over her shoulder toward the back of the house, where I could hear David's laugh mixing with the voices of their guests. When she turned back to me, her expression was cold in a way I had never seen before. "Eleanor, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This party is really for our friends and colleagues. It's more of a professional networking event than a family gathering." I felt my smile falter as her words sank in. "I'm sorry, what do you mean? David invited me himself. He said it was a housewarming party for the family and friends." "David can be sentimental sometimes," Stephanie said with a slight laugh that held no humor. "But the reality is that this gathering is important for our careers. We're trying to make connections in the neighborhood and with my colleagues. Having family here would change the dynamic we're going for." The gifts felt heavy in my hands as I tried to process what she was saying. "Stephanie, I don't understand. I'm David's mother. Why wouldn't I be welcome at your housewarming?" "It's not that you're not welcome," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise.
It's just that this particular event isn't appropriate for family. Maybe we can have you over for dinner next week." I could feel heat rising in my cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and growing anger. "Stephanie, I helped you buy this house. I co-signed the mortgage when David's credit wasn't quite strong enough on its own. I think that earns me the right to see the home I helped make possible." Something flashed in Stephanie's eyes, and for a moment, I saw something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Oh, Eleanor, that's exactly the kind of thing we don't want to get into today. Let's not make this about money or obligations. That would be so uncomfortable for everyone." The condescension in her voice was unmistakable now. She was treating me like an embarrassing relative who didn't understand social boundaries. I could hear more laughter from the backyard, and I caught a glimpse of David through the window, animated and happy as he talked with a group of people I didn't recognize. "I'd like to speak with David," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "David is busy hosting right now. I really think it would be better if you called him tomorrow. We can all discuss this when emotions aren't running high." "Emotions weren't running high until you decided to humiliate me on your doorstep," I thought, but I tried one more time to reason with her. "Stephanie, I drove 20 minutes to get here. I brought gifts for your new home. I don't understand why you're treating me this way." "I'm not treating you anyway," she said, her voice taking on an edge of irritation. "I'm simply trying to manage an event that's important for our future. Sometimes that means making difficult social decisions." That was when I heard David's voice calling from inside the house.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
"Steph, who's at the door?" Stephanie turned her head toward his voice. "It's just someone making a delivery," she called back. "I'll handle it." The lie hit me like a physical blow. She had just told my own son that I was a delivery person, rather than admit his mother was standing at their front door. The humiliation was so complete, so deliberate, that for a moment I couldn't speak. "You just lied to him about me," I managed to say. "I managed the situation," she corrected. "David doesn't need the stress of family drama during an important event." Family drama, as if my presence at my son's housewarming party would constitute drama, as if the woman who had helped them secure their mortgage was creating a problem by wanting to celebrate their new home. "Stephanie," I said, my voice shaking with anger now, "I want to see my son." "And I want this party to go smoothly," she replied. "We both can't get what we want today." Before I could respond, she began closing the door. "Have a lovely afternoon, Eleanor. We'll talk soon." The door clicked shut, leaving me standing alone on the porch with my gifts and my shattered dignity. Through the window, I could see Stephanie walking back toward the kitchen, smoothing her hair as if nothing had happened. The sounds of the party continued unabated, my son's voice among them, completely unaware that his mother had just been turned away from his home. I stood there for several minutes, trying to process what had just occurred. Cars continued to pull up to the house, and I watched as couple after couple walked up the same pathway I had just used, welcomed warmly into the home I had helped them purchase. A woman in her 30s wearing a designer jacket smiled and waved at me as she passed, probably assuming I was another guest taking a moment outside. The irony was crushing. Here I was, standing outside a house that bore my financial responsibility, watching strangers be welcomed into a home I was being excluded from. The mortgage papers I had signed were sitting in my filing cabinet at home, legal documents that tied me to this property for the next 27 years. I was financially responsible for their American dream, but apparently not worthy of sharing in their celebration. As I walked back to my car, I passed more arriving guests. A couple around David's age climbed out of a Tesla, the woman carrying a beautiful arrangement of flowers. Behind them, an older man in an expensive suit emerged from a BMW, checking his watch as he walked toward the front door. These were the people Stephanie deemed appropriate for their housewarming party, while the woman who had made it possible for them to qualify for the loan was sent away like an unwanted solicitor. I sat in my car for a moment, watching the steady stream of guests being welcomed into the house.
Through the windows, I could see people moving around the main floor, wine glasses in hand, admiring the home's features. David appeared in the front window at one point, gesturing animatedly as he spoke to someone I couldn't see. He looked happy and relaxed, completely unaware of what had just transpired on his doorstep. The drive home passed in a blur of anger and hurt. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, the humiliation had crystallized into something harder and more focused. I wasn't just angry about being excluded from the party, I was angry about being lied to, about being treated as if my contribution to their success was embarrassing rather than generous, about being dismissed as if I were some kind of social liability. Frank and I had lived in our modest ranch house for 30 years, raising David here, celebrating his achievements, supporting his dreams. The house was paid off now, a symbol of the financial stability Frank and I had built through careful planning and hard work. It was that stability that had allowed me to co-sign David's mortgage, to help him achieve something that would have been impossible on his own. I went straight to my home office and pulled out the filing cabinet where I kept all my important documents. The mortgage papers were in a folder labeled David's House, a designation that now felt naive. It wasn't really David's house or even David and Stephanie's house. According to the legal documents I was looking at, it was also mine. My name was on those papers as a co-signer, making me equally responsible for the debt and equally entitled to the property rights. I had never paid much attention to the details when I signed them 6 months ago. David had explained that he needed a co-signer to qualify for the loan amount they wanted, and I had been happy to help. The mortgage broker had gone through the paperwork quickly, focusing on my income and assets, my credit score, and employment history. At the time, I had been proud to be able to help my son achieve his goal of homeownership. Now, reading through the documents more carefully, I began to understand the full implications of what I had signed. As a co-signer, I wasn't just guaranteeing the loan. I was equally responsible for the payments, and according to the fine print, I had certain rights regarding the property. If David and Stephanie defaulted on the payments, the lender could come after me for the full amount. But more importantly, as a co-signer with financial responsibility, I had legal standing regarding decisions about the property. I spent the next hour researching mortgage law online, trying to understand exactly what my position was. What I discovered was both enlightening and empowering. Co-signers weren't just financial guarantors. In many cases, they had rights that could be exercised if the primary borrowers violated the terms of the mortgage or if disputes arose about the property. More importantly, I learned that co-signers could request to be removed from a mortgage if they felt their financial interests were being jeopardized. This typically required either refinancing the loan without the co-signer or selling the property to satisfy the debt. Given that David and Stephanie had needed a co-signer in the first place, it was unlikely they could qualify for refinancing on their own, especially since they had only been making payments for 6 months. The more I read, the more I realized that Stephanie had made a critical error of judgment. She had treated me as if I were a bothersome relative with no real connection to their success, when in fact I was a legal partner in their most significant financial investment. The house she had just barred me from entering was as much mine as it was theirs, at least according to the mortgage documents. As the afternoon wore on, my phone remained silent. David didn't call to ask why I hadn't made it to the party. He didn't text to check if everything was all right. Apparently, Stephanie's lie about a delivery person had been sufficient to explain my absence. Or perhaps he was too caught up in entertaining their guests to notice that his mother had never appeared from his home. By evening, I had made my decision. If Stephanie wanted to play games about family and belonging, then we would play by the rules she had established. She had made it clear that my emotional connection to David and my desire to be part of their celebration meant nothing to her. She had reduced our relationship to a purely transactional level, treating my financial contribution as something to be ashamed of rather than grateful for. Fine, if transactions were the only thing Stephanie understood, then we would deal with each other on purely transactional terms. I pulled out my phone and called my attorney, Margaret Chen, who had handled Frank's estate and had been my legal advisor for several years. Margaret was a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in family law and estate planning.
She was also available on weekends for her long-term clients, which I had definitely become. "Eleanor," Margaret said when she picked up, "how are you? I hope everything is all right." "I need some legal advice about a mortgage I co-signed," I said. "It's about David's house, and I think I may need to explore my options as a co-signer." "Has something happened with the mortgage payments?" Margaret asked, her tone becoming more professional. "Not with the payments," I said, "but there's been a significant change in my relationship with the borrowers, and I'm concerned about my ongoing financial exposure." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor, can you come in on Monday morning? I think we need to discuss this in detail. In the meantime, don't sign anything or make any commitments regarding the property." "I won't," I assured her. "But Margaret, I need to understand something right now. If I wanted to be removed from the mortgage, what would that involve?" "Typically, it would require the primary borrowers to refinance on their own or sell the property," Margaret explained. "As a co-signer, you have the right to request removal, especially if you feel your financial interests are being compromised. But Eleanor, this is a big step. Are you sure something hasn't happened that we should discuss immediately?" I told Margaret about the events of the afternoon, about being turned away from the housewarming party, and Stephanie's dismissive attitude toward my financial contribution to their home purchase. Margaret listened without interrupting, asking occasional clarifying questions about what exactly had been said. "Eleanor," Margaret said when I finished, "what Stephanie did was incredibly disrespectful, and I understand why you're angry. But removing yourself from a mortgage is a serious legal action with significant consequences. If David and Stephanie can't refinance on their own, they would be forced to sell the house." "I understand that," I said. "But Margaret, I don't think Stephanie understands that my name on those mortgage papers means something. I don't think she realizes that treating me like an embarrassment while I'm financially responsible for their debt is a very dangerous game to play." "It is dangerous," Margaret agreed. "But I want you to think carefully about whether this is really the road you want to go down. Family relationships are complicated, and legal actions can have consequences that last much longer than the legal proceedings themselves." "I've been thinking about that all afternoon," I said, "and here's what I've decided. Stephanie has made it clear that she doesn't value me as family. She's reduced our relationship to a purely financial arrangement. If that's how she wants to play this, then I'm going to make sure she understands exactly what that financial arrangement entails." Margaret sighed. "All right, come in first thing Monday morning and we'll go over your options. In the meantime, I'm going to pull the mortgage documents and review the specific terms of your cosigner agreement." After hanging up with Margaret, I spent the rest of the evening thinking about what I was planning to do. Part of me hoped that David would call, that he would realize something was wrong and reach out to find out why I hadn't come to the party. Part of me hoped he would give me a chance to explain what had happened, and that together we could work through this situation with Stephanie. But as the hours passed and my phone remained silent, I realized that David's lack of concern was almost as hurtful as Stephanie's behavior. Either he had completely bought into his wife's lie about a delivery person, or he had noticed my absence and simply didn't care enough to check on me. Neither possibility reflected well on the man I had raised him to be. Sunday passed quietly. I went to church, as I did every week, and found some comfort in the familiar rituals and the company of people who had known Frank and me for decades. Several people asked about David and how he was enjoying his new house, and I found myself giving vague, positive responses rather than explaining what had happened. The humiliation was still too fresh, too raw to share with anyone except Margaret. That evening, David finally called. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice cheerful and relaxed. "How was your weekend?" The casualness of his tone, as if nothing unusual had happened, caught me off guard. "My weekend was interesting," I said carefully. "How was your housewarming party?" "It was great," David said enthusiastically. "We had about 40 people, and everyone loved the house.
Steph did an amazing job organizing everything. The catering was perfect, and the weather held out so we could use the backyard. I waited for him to mention my absence, to ask why I hadn't been there. When he didn't, I decided to give him one chance to address it himself. "It sounds like it was a lovely event," I said. "I'm sorry I missed it." "Oh, that's right. Steph mentioned that you had stopped by but couldn't stay. Was everything okay?" Stopped by but couldn't stay. That was how Stephanie had characterized my humiliation to my own son. Not that she had turned me away from the door, not that she had lied about my identity to avoid letting me in, but that I simply had decided not to stay. "David," I said, choosing my words carefully, "I think you and I need to have a conversation about what actually happened yesterday." "What do you mean?" David asked, and I could hear genuine confusion in his voice. "Steph said you had something come up and couldn't make it to the party." So Stephanie had told him multiple versions of the story. First, I was a delivery person. Then I had stopped by but couldn't stay. Now I had something come up. The lies were multiplying, each one designed to minimize my importance and cover up her behavior. "David," I said, "I was at your front door yesterday with housewarming gifts, and Stephanie told me I wasn't welcome at the party. She said it was for colleagues and professional contacts only, and that having family there would change the dynamic."
When you called out asking who was at the door, she told you it was someone making a delivery. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. When David finally spoke, his voice was different, less certain. "Mom, that doesn't sound right. Why would Steph do something like that?" "I don't know why she would do it," I said, "but I know what happened. I was standing on your porch, David, wanting to celebrate your new home, and your wife told me I wasn't appropriate company for your friends." "There must have been some kind of misunderstanding," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Steph would never intentionally hurt you like that." "Wouldn't she?" I asked. "David, I want you to think about something. I co-signed the mortgage for your house. Without my signature, you wouldn't have qualified for the loan. Yesterday, the woman who made your home ownership possible was told she wasn't welcome to see the home she helped you buy." "Mom, you know how grateful we are for your help with the mortgage," David said quickly. "That has nothing to do with what happened yesterday." "Doesn't it?" I asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like Stephanie is happy to accept my financial assistance, but embarrassed to acknowledge my existence." "That's not fair," David said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. "Steph works really hard to build professional relationships. Maybe she just didn't think clearly about how to handle the situation." I felt a chill at his words. Even when confronted with the truth of what his wife had done, David was making excuses for her behavior and minimizing my hurt. The son I had raised to value honesty and kindness was choosing to protect his wife's reputation over acknowledging the pain she had caused his mother. "David," I said, "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Do you think it was appropriate for Stephanie to turn me away from your housewarming party?" Another long pause. I think maybe there was a miscommunication about what kind of event it was supposed to be. It wasn't a direct answer, and we both knew it. David was choosing to hide behind diplomatic language rather than acknowledge that his wife had treated his mother poorly. In that moment, I realized that Stephanie's influence over him was stronger than I had understood. She had managed to convince him that her version of events was more trustworthy than his own mother's account. "I see," I said. "Well, David, I think you and Stephanie need to know that I'm exploring my options regarding the mortgage I co-signed." "What do you mean, exploring your options?" David asked, alarm creeping into his voice. "I mean that I'm consulting with my attorney about my rights and responsibilities as a co-signer," I said. "Yesterday's events have made me realize
that I need to protect my financial interests. Mom, you're not thinking of doing something drastic, are you? I mean, we've never missed a payment. We're completely current on the mortgage. This isn't about missed payments, I said. This is about respect and family relationships. Stephanie has made it clear that she views my involvement in your lives as purely financial. If that's the case, then I need to make sure I'm protected legally. Can we talk about this in person? David asked. Maybe the three of us can sit down and work through whatever happened yesterday. The three of us? I repeated. David, do you understand that part of the problem is that you're treating this like a dispute between equals? I'm your mother, the woman who raised you, who loved you unconditionally, who helped you buy your home. Stephanie is the woman who turned me away from your door and then lied to you about it. We're not in equivalent positions here. I know you're my mother, David said, sounding frustrated. But Steph is my wife. I have to consider her feelings too. Have to consider her feelings? I said. David, when did you stop considering mine? The question hung in the air between us. I could hear David breathing on the other end of the line, but he didn't have an answer. Or perhaps the answer was too painful for both of us to acknowledge. I need to go, I said, finally. I have an appointment with my attorney tomorrow morning. After that, I'll have a better understanding of where we stand. Mom, please don't do anything rash, are you? I mean, we've never missed a payment. We're completely current on the mortgage. This isn't about missed payments, I said. This is about respect and family relationships. Stephanie has made it clear that she views my involvement in your lives as purely financial. If that's the case, then I need to make sure I'm protected legally. Can we talk about this in person? David asked. Maybe the three of us can sit down and work through whatever happened yesterday. The three of us? I repeated. David, do you understand that part of the problem is that you're treating this like a dispute between equals? I'm your mother, the woman who raised you, who loved you unconditionally, who helped you buy your home. Stephanie is the woman who turned me away from your door and then lied to you about it. We're not in equivalent positions here. I know you're my mom, David said, sounding frustrated, but Steph is my wife. I have to consider her feelings too. Have to consider her feelings, I said. David, when did you stop considering mine? The question hung in the air between us. I could hear David breathing on the other end of the line, but he didn't have an answer. Or perhaps the answer was too painful for both of us to acknowledge. I need to go, I said finally. I have an appointment with my attorney tomorrow morning. After that, I'll have a better understanding of where we stand. Mom, please don't do anything rash, David said. Let's just talk this through like a family. Family? I repeated. David, yesterday your wife made it very clear that I'm not considered family when it comes to celebrating your achievements. So we'll handle this the way she prefers, as a business arrangement. I hung up before David could respond, my hands shaking with anger and heartbreak. The conversation had confirmed my worst fears about how far Stephanie's influence had spread. David was choosing to protect his wife's feelings over acknowledging the truth of her behavior. He was asking me to minimize my own hurt in order to preserve his marriage's harmony. That night, I lay awake thinking about the little boy David had been, the teenager who had confided in me about his dreams and fears, the young man who had called me every week during college just to hear my voice.
Somewhere along the way, that son had been replaced by a man who was willing to let his wife lie about his mother and then ask his mother to pretend it hadn't happened. But I wasn't going to pretend. Stephanie had drawn a line in the sand when she slammed that door in my face, and I was going to show her exactly what was on the other side of that line. Monday morning couldn't come soon enough. Margaret Chen's law office occupied the top floor of a converted Victorian house in the Hawthorne district, its tall windows offering a view of the tree-lined streets below.
I had been coming here for legal matters since Frank's diagnosis 3 years ago, and the familiar surroundings usually brought me comfort. Today, however, I felt nothing but grim determination as I climbed the narrow staircase to Margaret's office. Margaret greeted me with her usual professional warmth, though I could see concern in her dark eyes as she ushered me into her office. At 53, she had the kind of quiet authority that came from 2 decades of handling complex family legal matters. Her desk was organized with military precision, and I noticed she had already pulled several thick folders that I assumed contained information about mortgage law and cosigner rights. "Eleanor," she said, as we settled into the comfortable chairs by her window, "I spent yesterday evening researching your situation. Before we dive into the legal options, I want you to tell me exactly what you hope to accomplish here." I had been asking myself the same question since Saturday night. What did I want? Revenge against Stephanie for her humiliation? Justice for being treated so dismissively? Or something deeper? Something about respect and recognition of my worth as both a mother and a financial partner in their success. "I want Stephanie to understand that actions have consequences," I said finally. "She treated me as if I were some embarrassing relative who had no real connection to their success. She needs to learn that the woman she humiliated is the same woman whose signature made their dream house possible." Margaret nodded slowly. "I understand the emotional motivation, and frankly, what she did was inexcusable, but I need you to think practically about the potential outcomes. If you pursue removal from the mortgage, there are really only 2 possibilities. Either David and Stephanie qualify for refinancing on their own, which seems unlikely given that they needed a cosigner initially, or they're forced to sell the house." "I understand that," I said. "And, Margaret, I've thought about this carefully. If they can refinance and remove me from the mortgage, then everyone gets what they want. They keep their house, and I'm no longer financially tied to people who don't value my contribution. But if they can't refinance, then they lose the house," Margaret finished. "Eleanor, are you prepared for David to lose his home over this? Because that's a very real possibility." The question cut to the heart of my internal struggle. Was I prepared to see my son lose his house because his wife had treated me poorly? 6 months ago, the answer would have been an immediate no. But 6 months ago, I also would have never believed David would allow his wife to lie about me and then ask me to pretend it hadn't happened. "Margaret, let me ask you something," I said. "If your adult child's spouse treated you the way Stephanie treated me, and then your child chose to protect the spouse's feelings over acknowledging your hurt, what would you do?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her considering the question not just as my attorney, but as a mother herself. She had 2 grown children, and I knew from our conversations over the years that family dynamics were just as complicated for lawyers as they were for everyone else. "I'd be devastated," she admitted, "and I'd probably want to take some kind of action to protect myself and make a point. But Eleanor, there's a difference between wanting to do something and actually doing it. Once we start this process, it's very difficult to undo." "What exactly would the process involve?" I asked. Margaret opened one of the folders on her desk and pulled out several documents. "I've reviewed your cosigner agreement, and you do have grounds to request removal from the mortgage. The language is actually quite favorable to your position. Cosigners can petition for removal if they feel their financial interests are being jeopardized, or if the primary borrowers engage in behavior that undermines the cosigner's confidence in their ability to maintain the loan." "Stephanie's behavior could qualify under that provision," I asked. "Potentially, yes. The fact that she's treating you dismissively while you remain financially responsible for their debt could be argued as behavior that undermines your confidence in the arrangement. But Eleanor, we'd need to be very strategic about how we present this case." Margaret spread several documents across her desk, pointing to specific clauses as she explained my options. The legal language was dense, but the basic concepts were clear enough. As a cosigner, I had entered into a financial partnership with David and Stephanie. That partnership came with both obligations and rights, and those rights could be exercised if the primary borrowers violated the spirit of the agreement. "What would happen if I formally requested removal from the mortgage?" I asked. "The lender would evaluate whether David and Stephanie qualify for the loan on their own.
Given current interest rates and the fact that their credit situation hasn't changed dramatically in 6 months, it's unlikely they would qualify for the same loan amount at comparable terms. The lender would probably offer them a smaller loan amount at a higher interest rate, which would require them to either make up the difference in cash or sell the property. And if they can't make up the difference, then they'd be forced to sell, said Margaret simply. The lender isn't going to carry a loan that doesn't meet their current underwriting standards just because the borrowers want to keep their house. I stared at the documents spread across Margaret's desk, trying to imagine David and Stephanie's reaction when they realized the full implications of what Stephanie had done. Would David finally understand that his wife's behavior had real consequences? Would Stephanie grasp that her dismissive attitude toward me had jeopardized the very foundation of their homeownership? How long would this process take? I asked. If we filed a petition this week, the lender would probably respond within 30 days. They'd give David and Stephanie 90 days to either refinance or arrange for sale of the property. So we're looking at 4 to 5 months from start to finish. Long enough for emotions to escalate and positions to harden, but not long enough for David and Stephanie to dramatically improve their financial situation. Margaret, I need to understand something else, I said. If this process moves forward, is there any way for me to stop it once it starts? Margaret's expression grew more serious. That's complicated. Once we file the petition, the lender is obligated to respond according to the terms of the mortgage agreement. We could withdraw the petition, but that doesn't mean the lender would forget about the concerns we've raised. They might decide to review the loan independently, especially if they have any doubts about the borrower's stability. So, even if I changed my mind, the damage might already be done? It's possible, Margaret admitted. Eleanor, this is why I want you to be absolutely certain about your decision. Legal actions create their own momentum, and that momentum can be very difficult to control once it starts. I thought about David's phone call the night before, his willingness to minimize what Stephanie had done, his suggestion that I should somehow accommodate her feelings while ignoring my own hurt. I thought about Stephanie's cold satisfaction as she closed the door in my face, her assumption that I would simply accept whatever treatment she chose to give me. What if I wanted to give them one more chance? I asked. What if I told them exactly what I'm considering and gave them an opportunity to make this right before filing any petitions? Margaret raised an eyebrow. What would making this right look like to you? I considered the question carefully. What would it take for me to feel like the situation had been resolved? An apology from Stephanie seemed like the bare minimum, but I wasn't sure that would be enough. There had been something so calculated about her behavior, so deliberately cruel, that a simple apology felt inadequate. I think I'd want Stephanie to acknowledge what she did wrong, I said slowly. Not just that there was a misunderstanding, but that she deliberately excluded me from an event celebrating a home I helped them purchase. And I'd want David to stop making excuses for her behavior and acknowledge that what she did was unacceptable. And if they refuse? Or if they offer half-hearted apologies that don't address the real issues? Then we file the petition, I said with more certainty than I had felt since this whole situation began. Margaret nodded. All right, I think that's a reasonable approach, but Eleanor, I want you to be prepared for the possibility that giving them advance warning might give them time to prepare counter-arguments or take actions that could complicate our position. What kind of actions? They might try to refinance immediately before we file the petition, or they might claim that you're acting irrationally, that this is about something other than their behavior. David might even argue that you're trying to manipulate them emotionally by threatening their housing security. The thought that David might characterize my actions as manipulation rather than a legitimate response to mistreatment was painful, but not surprising. His phone call had already shown me that he was more concerned with protecting Stephanie's image than understanding my perspective. Margaret, can they refinance without my knowledge? Not without your knowledge, but they could start the process. However,
removing a cosigner typically requires the cosigner's consent, especially if the cosigner is objecting to their removal. It's much easier to remove a willing cosigner than an unwilling one. I felt a small surge of satisfaction at this information. Stephanie had treated me as if I were powerless, as if my role in their mortgage was purely passive. She was about to learn that I had more control over their financial situation than she had realized. I think I want to confront them directly first, I said. I want to see Stephanie's face when she realizes what her behavior might cost them. Margaret made notes on a legal pad as we spoke. If you decide to go that route, I'd recommend being very clear about your position and your timeline. Don't let them think this is an empty threat or a negotiating tactic. Make it clear that you're serious about protecting your financial interests and that their response will determine how you proceed. Should I give them a specific timeline for their response? I think a week would be reasonable, long enough for them to process what you're telling them and discuss it privately, but not so long that the threat loses its immediacy. We spent another hour going over the specific language I should use and the legal principles that supported my position. Margaret prepared a draft petition that could be filed immediately if David and Stephanie's response was inadequate, and she walked me through the likely timeline and consequences of each possible outcome. By the time I left Margaret's office, I felt armed with both legal knowledge and moral clarity. What I was considering wasn't revenge or manipulation. It was a legitimate response to being mistreated by people who had benefited from my generosity. Stephanie had gambled that I would accept her dismissive treatment rather than risk damaging my relationship with David. She was about to learn that she had calculated wrong. The drive home gave me time to think about how I wanted to approach the confrontation. Should I call David and ask him to meet with me privately first? Should I show up at their house unannounced, the way problems have a habit of appearing at people's doors? Or should I invite them to my house, where I would have the home field advantage and access to all the mortgage documents I needed to make my case? I decided on the latter option. If David and Stephanie wanted to treat me as a purely financial entity rather than a family member, then we would conduct our business in a business-like setting. My house, my rules, my documents spread across the dining room table like evidence in a court of law. I called David that afternoon, keeping my voice neutral and professional. Hi, David. I need you and Stephanie to come over tonight so we can discuss the mortgage situation. 7 o'clock would work well for me. Mom, you're really starting to worry me with all this talk about the mortgage. Can't we just talk on the phone? No, this conversation needs to happen in person, and it needs to include Stephanie. This affects all three of us, and we all need to be present for the discussion. What exactly are we going to discuss? David asked. We're going to discuss my rights and responsibilities as a co-signer on your mortgage and how Stephanie's behavior on Saturday has affected my willingness to continue in that role.
There was a long pause before David responded. Mom, are you threatening us? I'm informing you that we need to have a conversation about our financial arrangement, I said calmly. Whether you choose to view that as a threat is up to you. Fine, David said, though his tone suggested it was anything but fine. We'll be there at 7. After hanging up, I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for the meeting. I spread the mortgage documents across my dining room table, organizing them so that the most important clauses were easily visible. I printed out the research I had done about cosigner rights and the information Margaret had given me about the removal process. I wanted everything to be clear and factual, with no room for misinterpretation or emotional manipulation. At exactly 7 o'clock, I heard David's BMW pull into my driveway. Through the front window, I watched as he and Stephanie walked up the path to my front door. Stephanie was wearing a cream-colored sweater and dark jeans, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She looked casual and confident, as if she were coming to discuss dinner plans rather than the potential loss of her home. David knocked rather than using his key, a small signal that he understood this meeting was formal rather than a casual family visit. When I opened the door, both of them wore expressions of polite concern, as if they were humoring a relative who had become overly dramatic about a minor incident.
"Come in," I said, stepping aside to let them enter. "We'll be meeting in the dining room." I could see David glance toward the living room, where we usually sat for family conversations, but I led them directly to the dining room where I had prepared my materials. The mortgage documents were spread across the mahogany table like a paper landscape of legal obligations and financial responsibilities. Stephanie's eyes widened slightly when she saw the documents, and for the first time since Saturday, I saw genuine uncertainty in her expression. David pulled out a chair for his wife, then sat down beside her, both of them facing me across the table. "Thank you for coming," I said, settling into my own chair. "I asked you here tonight because we need to discuss the implications of what happened on Saturday and how it affects our ongoing financial relationship." "Mom," David began, "I really think you're making too big a deal out of what was probably just a misunderstanding." "David, let me be very clear about something," I interrupted. "There was no misunderstanding on Saturday. Stephanie deliberately turned me away from your housewarming party, lied to you about my identity when you asked who was at the door, and then gave you false information about why I wasn't at the party. These weren't mistakes or miscommunications, they were choices." Stephanie spoke for the first time since entering my house. "Eleanor, I think emotions are running high, and maybe we're all reading more into Saturday than we should. It was a stressful day, and maybe I could have handled things better." "Maybe you could have handled things better," I repeated. "Stephanie, you told me I wasn't appropriate company for your professional colleagues. You treated me like an embarrassing relative who had no business celebrating your success. And you did this while I am legally and financially responsible for making your success possible." I picked up the mortgage documents and placed them directly in front of them. "These are the papers I signed 6 months ago that enabled you to purchase your house. Without my signature, without my income and credit history and financial assets, you would not have qualified for that loan. Do you understand that?" David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Of course we understand that, Mom. We've always been grateful for your help." "Have you?" I asked. "Because Saturday suggests otherwise. Saturday suggests that while you're happy to accept my financial assistance, you're embarrassed to acknowledge my existence." Stephanie's cheeks flushed, and I could see anger beginning to replace her earlier uncertainty. "Eleanor, that's not fair. One awkward social situation doesn't erase our appreciation for your help." "One awkward social situation," I said. "Is that how you're characterizing what happened? Stephanie, you slammed the door in my face and then lied to my son about who had been at the door. That wasn't awkward, that was cruel." "I was trying to manage a difficult situation," Stephanie said, her voice rising slightly. "The party was important for our careers, and I made a judgment call about what would work best for everyone." "Everyone except me," I pointed out. "Your judgment call prioritized your professional image over my feelings and my role in making your home ownership possible." David leaned forward, his expression pleading. "Mom, can't we just agree that mistakes were made and move forward? Steph didn't mean to hurt you." "Actually, David, I think she did mean to hurt me, or at the very least, she meant to put me in my place. She wanted to make it clear that while my money was welcome, my presence was not." I pulled out the research I had printed about cosigner rights and placed it next to the mortgage documents. "This brings me to why we're here tonight. As a cosigner on your mortgage, I have certain rights. One of those rights is the ability to request removal from the loan if I feel my financial interests are being jeopardized." The color drained from David's face. "What do you mean, request removal?" "I mean that I can petition the lender to remove me from the mortgage. If I do that, you would need to either refinance the loan on your own or sell the house to satisfy the debt." Stephanie's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. "You would do that? You would force us to lose our house because of one bad day?" "I would do that to protect myself from continued financial exposure to people who treat me with disrespect." "Stephanie, you can't have this both ways. You can't treat me as if I'm irrelevant to your life while expecting me to remain responsible for your largest debt."
David was staring at the documents on the table as if they contained a foreign language. "Mum, you can't be serious about this. We just bought the house. We've put everything we have into it. And I co-signed for it," I reminded him, "which means I'm just as invested in this property as you are, both financially and legally. But apparently I'm not considered invested enough to be welcome at a party celebrating it." Stephanie suddenly stood up, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This is ridiculous. You're talking about destroying our lives because I made one mistake at a party?" "Sit down, Stephanie," I said calmly. "We're not finished." For a moment I thought she might refuse, might storm out of my house the way she had shut me out of hers. But David reached up and gently pulled her back into her chair, his face pale with understanding of just how serious this conversation had become. "What do you want from us?" Stephanie asked, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I want acknowledgement," I said. "I want you to admit that what you did on Saturday was wrong, not just poorly handled or a mistake, but wrong. I want you to understand that the woman you humiliated is the same woman whose financial backing made your dream house possible." "Fine," Stephanie said through gritted teeth. "What I did on Saturday was wrong. I shouldn't have turned you away from the party. Are you happy now?" The apology felt hollow, forced, containing no real understanding or remorse. It was exactly the kind of half-hearted acknowledgement Margaret had warned me about, designed to diffuse my anger without accepting real responsibility. "No, Stephanie, I'm not happy," I said, "because that apology tells me you still don't understand what you did or why it was so harmful." David looked back and forth between us, clearly struggling with the dynamics of the conversation. "Mum, what more do you want?" Steph apologized. "David, let me ask you something," I said. "Do you think your wife's apology was sincere? Do you think she genuinely understands why her behavior was wrong?" David glanced at his wife, and I could see him weighing his response carefully. "I think she's trying to make things right." Trying to make things right and actually making them right are two different things, I said. Stephanie's apology was designed to make this conversation go away, not to address the real issues between us. Stephanie leaned forward, her eyes flashing with anger. "What do you want me to do, Eleanor? Grovel? Beg your forgiveness? I said I was wrong. I said I was sorry. What more can I possibly do?" "You could start by explaining why you thought it was acceptable to treat me that way in the first place," I said. "You could help me understand what goes through someone's mind when they decide to humiliate the person who made their success possible." "I wasn't trying to humiliate you," Stephanie protested. "I was trying to manage a professional event." "By lying about my identity to my own son?" "I panicked," Stephanie said. "I made a bad decision in the moment." "You made several bad decisions," I corrected. "You decided I wasn't worthy to be at your party. You decided to lie to David about who was at the door. You decided to give him false information about why I didn't attend. Those weren't panicked reactions. Those were calculated choices." The room fell silent except for the sound of the grandfather clock in the hallway marking the passage of time. David was staring at his hands, apparently unable to look at either his wife or his mother. Stephanie was glaring at me with unconcealed resentment, no longer bothering to hide her true feelings behind a facade of politeness. "So what happens now?" David asked finally. "That depends on your wife," I said. "I'm going to give you both 1 week to decide how you want to handle this situation. If I receive a genuine apology that demonstrates real understanding of what went wrong, and if I see evidence that my role in your family will be respected going forward, then we can continue with our current arrangement." "And if not?" Stephanie asked. "Then I file a petition to be removed from your mortgage," I said simply. "My attorney has already prepared the paperwork.
It's your choice." David's head snapped up. "You've already talked to a lawyer about this?" "Of course I have," I said. "David, did you think I would make threats about legal action without understanding my options? I'm not playing games here. I'm protecting my interests." Stephanie stood up again, this time with obvious intention to leave. "Come on, David, we don't have to sit here and listen to threats." "Actually, you do."
Because those aren't threats, they're options, and the choice between those options is entirely up to you. David remained seated even as his wife moved toward the door. "Mom, can we have some time to think about this?" "You have a week," I said. "After that, I move forward with the legal process." Stephanie was already at the dining room entrance, her posture rigid with anger. "David, are you coming?" David looked at me one more time, his expression a mixture of confusion and betrayal. "I never thought you would do something like this." "And I never thought you would let your wife treat me the way she did," I replied. "But here we are." After they left, I sat at my dining room table surrounded by the mortgage documents and legal papers, feeling both exhausted and oddly relieved. The conversation had gone exactly as I had expected it would. Stephanie's apology had been grudging and superficial. David had continued to minimize the situation, and neither of them had shown any real understanding of why their behavior had been so hurtful. But I had also seen something else in their faces as the reality of their situation became clear. For the first time since Saturday, they understood that their actions had consequences, that the woman they had dismissed so casually held real power over their financial future. The next week would tell me everything I needed to know about the kind of people they really were and the kind of relationship we could have going forward. Either they would choose to truly address what had happened and work toward rebuilding trust, or they would continue to treat me as if my feelings and dignity were less important than their convenience. Either way, I would know where I stood, and I would act accordingly. The phone started ringing later that evening, but I didn't answer it. Whatever David or Stephanie wanted to say could wait until they had time to really think about their options and what they were willing to do to preserve their home and their relationship with me. For the first time since Saturday, I felt like I had some control over my own story. Stephanie had tried to write me out of their narratives of success, but she was about to learn that some characters refuse to be edited out of the stories they helped create. The silence that followed David and Stephanie's departure was unlike any quiet I had experienced in my own home. It wasn't the peaceful stillness that usually filled my evenings, but something charged with anticipation and unresolved tension. I knew that across town, in their beautiful colonial house that my signature had made possible, a very different kind of conversation was taking place. I didn't have to wait long to find out what that conversation had produced. The next morning, my phone rang at 7:30, an hour earlier than David typically called anyone. His voice was strained, carrying the weight of a sleepless night and difficult realizations. "Mom, we need to talk again. Can I come over this morning, alone?" The request to come alone was telling. It suggested that either David had finally understood the gravity of the situation and wanted to address it without Stephanie's interference, or that there had been a significant disagreement between them about how to respond to my ultimatum. "Of course," I said. "I'll put coffee on." David arrived within the hour, looking haggard in a way that reminded me of his college years during finals week. His usually neat hair was disheveled, and he was wearing the same clothes from the night before, suggesting he either stayed up all night or gotten dressed in a hurry. The confident professional who had attended the housewarming party just days earlier was nowhere to be seen. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said as he settled into the kitchen chair where he had eaten countless breakfast meals as a child. The familiar setting seemed to emphasize how far we had strayed from the easy relationship we once shared. "You're my son," I said simply. "I will always see you." David stared into his coffee cup for several minutes before speaking. "Steph and I talked until 3 in the morning. Actually, we argued until 3 in the morning. She thinks you're being manipulative and unreasonable. She thinks you're using the mortgage as a weapon to force her to grovel." I waited for him to continue, curious about whether he would share his own perspective or simply relay his wife's grievances.
But I keep thinking about Saturday, David continued. I keep replaying what you told me happened, and I realize I didn't want to believe it because it would mean accepting that my wife could be cruel to my mother. And now, I asked, now I think I need to hear the truth from you one more time, and I need to really listen instead of trying to make excuses for her. So I told him again, in careful detail, about everything that had happened at their front door. I described Stephanie's cold demeanor, her dismissive explanation about professional networking, her lie when he called out asking who was there. I told him about the humiliation of standing on their porch with gifts in my hands while strangers were welcomed into the home I had helped them purchase. David listened without interrupting, his face growing more troubled with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, processing not just what I was telling him, but what it meant about the woman he had married. "She really told me you were just a delivery person?" he asked finally. "She did. And when I asked her later about you not being at the party, she said you had something come up?" "That's right." David rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture I remembered from his teenage years when he was struggling with difficult emotions. "Mom, I don't know how to reconcile the woman who did those things with the woman I married. Steph has never been cruel. She's ambitious and focused on her career, but she's not mean." David, I think you're discovering that people can reveal new aspects of themselves when they feel threatened or when their priorities are challenged. Stephanie's professional image was more important to her than my feelings. That tells you something about her values that maybe you hadn't seen before. "But why would she see you as a threat to her professional image?" David asked. "You're a retired teacher. You're intelligent, well-spoken, appropriately dressed."
There's nothing about you that would embarrass anyone. The question went to the heart of what had hurt me most about Stephanie's behavior. It wasn't just that she had excluded me, but that she had treated me as if I were somehow socially unacceptable, as if my presence would reflect poorly on their success. "I think," I said carefully, "that Stephanie wanted complete control over the narrative of your success. She wanted to present you both as a self-made couple who had achieved homeownership through their own efforts. Having your mother there, especially knowing that your mother's financial backing had made the purchase possible, would have complicated that story." David's expression shifted as understanding dawned. She was embarrassed that we needed help? More than that, I think she was embarrassed that the help came from me. It's one thing to need financial assistance from a bank or a wealthy investor. It's another thing to need it from your mother-in-law, especially when that mother-in-law might mention the arrangement to people at the party. "But you would never have said anything inappropriate about the mortgage," David protested. "Of course not. But Stephanie didn't trust me to maintain her preferred version of events. So instead of taking that risk, she eliminated the problem by eliminating me." David stood up and walked to the kitchen window, staring out at the garden Frank and I had cultivated over decades of shared effort. "I feel like I don't know her at all," he said quietly. "The woman I married would never have done something so cruel." "Perhaps the woman you married had never been in a situation where her image and your mother's dignity were in conflict," I suggested. "Saturday showed you which one she prioritizes." "She keeps saying you're overreacting," David said, turning back to face me. "She says that what happened was awkward and unfortunate, but that destroying our housing situation is a disproportionate response." "David, let me ask you something. If a business partner treated you the way Stephanie treated me and then minimized your concerns and offered a hollow apology, would you want to continue that business relationship?" "No," he admitted. "I'd want to end the partnership as quickly as possible." "Then why should this be different? Because we're family?" "Family relationships should be held to higher standards than business relationships, not lower ones." David sank back into his chair, the weight of the situation clearly overwhelming him. "What am I supposed to do, Mom? I love Steph. I can't just abandon my marriage because she made a terrible mistake." "I'm not asking you to abandon your marriage," I said. "I'm asking you to acknowledge that what she did was wrong and to make sure it never happens again.
I have acknowledged it. I told her last night that her behavior was unacceptable and that she needed to make a real apology to you. And what did she say? David's expression told me everything I needed to know before he spoke. She said she already apologized and that you're being unreasonable by demanding more than that. So Stephanie had learned nothing from our confrontation the night before. She still viewed herself as the victim of my unreasonable expectations, rather than the perpetrator of deliberate cruelty. Her position hadn't softened, it had hardened. David, your wife's response tells me that she doesn't understand what she did wrong, and more importantly, she doesn't care that I hurt me. How can I continue to be financially responsible for someone who treats me with such disregard? I understand your position, David said miserably. But Mom, if you go through with this, Steph and I will lose our house. We can't qualify for the mortgage on our own. We'd have to sell everything and start over. And whose fault would that be? I asked gently. David, I didn't create this situation. Stephanie did. The consequences you're facing are the natural result of her choices, not mine. But you're the one choosing to pursue those consequences. I'm the one choosing to protect myself from continued exposure to someone who has shown me that my dignity means nothing to her. There's a difference. David buried his face in his hands. This is going to destroy my marriage. No, David, Stephanie's behavior is what's threatening your marriage. If she had treated me with basic respect and courtesy, we wouldn't be having this conversation. If she had offered a genuine apology that showed real understanding of her mistakes, we could have moved forward. But she chose to double down on her position instead of making things right. What if I could convince her to give you a better apology? What if she came here and really explained why she was wrong and promised to do better? I looked at my son, this man that I have raised to be honest and kind, who was now bargaining for his wife's redemption. The fact that he was asking me to accept a manufactured apology, one he would have to convince her to give, showed how far their relationship had strayed from authentic communication. David, do you really want your wife to apologize to me only because you forced her to? Do you want to build your marriage on the foundation of you managing her behavior toward your family? I want to save my marriage and keep my house, he said bluntly. Those are two different goals, I pointed out, and achieving both of them requires Stephanie to genuinely change her attitude toward me, not just go through the motions of an apology. How can I make her understand that? The question revealed so much about the dynamics of David's marriage. He was asking me how to make his wife care about his mother's feelings, how to convince her that cruelty was wrong, how to teach her basic empathy and respect. These weren't skills that could be learned through persuasion. They were fundamental character traits that either existed or didn't. David, you can't make someone be a better person. You can set boundaries about what behavior you'll accept, and you can make choices about how you respond when those boundaries are crossed.
But you can't force someone to develop compassion they don't possess. So what are you saying? That my marriage is doomed? I'm saying that your marriage has some serious problems that won't be solved by getting me to accept inadequate apologies. Stephanie showed you something about herself on Saturday. The question is whether you can accept that reality and work with it, or whether you need her to be someone she isn't. David was quiet for a long time, and I could see him wrestling with the implications of what I was saying. He had married Stephanie believing she was kind and caring, but her behavior toward me had revealed a capacity for calculated cruelty that didn't align with his image of her. What if she came here today and gave you a real apology? He asked finally. What if she acknowledged everything she did wrong and committed to treating you better in the future? If it was genuine, if it showed real understanding and remorse, then we could talk about moving forward, I said. But David, I need you to understand that I'm not going to accept another performance like last night. If Stephanie comes here, she needs to be prepared to have an honest conversation about her behavior and its impact. And if she won't do that, then I file the petition to be removed from your mortgage, and you and Stephanie face the consequences of her choices. David nodded slowly. I need to go home and talk to her. I need to help her understand that this isn't about you being difficult or unreasonable. This is about basic respect and decency.
Good luck, I said, and I meant it. David was about to have one of the most difficult conversations of his marriage, one that would test whether his wife was capable of growth and genuine remorse. After David left, I spent the rest of the day trying to focus on normal activities. I worked in the garden, organized my closets, prepared a simple dinner. But underneath the routine tasks, I was acutely aware that my son was fighting for his marriage and his home, and that the outcome depended on whether his wife could find the courage to admit she had been wrong. The call came that evening at 8 o'clock. David's voice was flat, drained of the hope he had carried that morning. "She won't do it, Mom. She won't admit that what she did was wrong beyond a simple mistake. She keeps saying that you're making too big a deal out of a social awkwardness and that demanding a more elaborate apology is unreasonable." I felt a strange mixture of disappointment and relief. Disappointment that Stephanie hadn't found the wisdom to salvage the situation, but relief that I wouldn't have to endure another insincere performance. "I'm sorry, David. I know you were hoping for a different outcome." "She said something else," David continued, his voice heavy with pain. "She said that if you go through with this threat, she'll never forgive you and she'll make sure our children never have a relationship with their grandmother." The threat hit me like a physical blow. David and Stephanie had been trying to get pregnant for the past year, and the possibility of being excluded from my future grandchildren's lives was almost unbearable to contemplate. "David, do you understand what your wife just did? She threatened to use your children as weapons against me. She's willing to deprive them of their grandmother's love to punish me for not accepting her mistreatment." "I know," David said quietly. "I told her that was wrong, that our kids should have a relationship with their grandmother regardless of what happens between you two." "And what did she say?" "She said that's up to you, that if you destroy our lives over something petty, you'll have to live with the consequences." I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, overwhelmed by the escalation of Stephanie's threats. She wasn't just refusing to acknowledge her wrongdoing, she was actively trying to punish me for standing up for myself. "David, I need you to understand something. Your wife's threats don't change the fundamental issue here. She treated me cruelly, she refuses to acknowledge it, and now she's trying to manipulate me through threats about my future grandchildren. This is not the behavior of someone who deserves my continued financial support." "So you're going to go through with it? You're going to file the petition?" The pain in David's voice was heartbreaking, but I couldn't let his suffering change my position. Stephanie had created this situation through her own choices, and now she was doubling down on those choices rather than taking responsibility for them. "David, your wife has made it clear that she will never treat me with respect or acknowledge when she's wrong. She's shown me that she's willing to use cruelty and manipulation to get her way. I cannot continue to be financially responsible for someone who views me as an enemy to be managed and controlled." "What about our marriage? What about the house?" "Those are consequences of Stephanie's behavior, not mine. I didn't want this outcome, David. I gave her multiple opportunities to make things right. She chose not to take them." "When?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow morning. I'm meeting with Margaret at 9 a.m. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for nearly a minute. When David finally spoke, his voice was thick with tears. "I can't believe this is happening. 3 days ago, we were celebrating our new house. Now I'm going to lose everything." "David, you're not losing everything. You're losing a house. You still have your career, your health, your intelligence, your capacity to rebuild. And if Stephanie is truly the woman you believe her to be, you'll get through this together and emerge stronger. And if she's not, then you'll have learned something important about her character that will help you make better decisions going forward."
After David hung up, I sat in my kitchen as darkness settled over the neighborhood. Tomorrow, I would set in motion a chain of events that would force my son and his wife to sell their dream home. It wasn't what I had wanted when I woke up on Saturday morning, excited about their housewarming party, but it was the natural consequence of Stephanie's choices and her refusal to acknowledge the harm she had caused. I thought about Frank and what he would have said about this situation. Frank had always believed in natural consequences, in letting people learn from their mistakes rather than protecting them from the results of their poor choices. He had also believed in standing up for yourself when you were treated unfairly, regardless of who was doing the treating. I knew Frank would have supported my decision to protect myself from Stephanie's ongoing disrespect. He also would have been heartbroken to see our son caught in the middle of such a painful situation. But Frank had raised David to be a man of integrity and character, and he would have expected David to choose what was right over what was convenient. The phone rang again at 9:30. This time, it was Stephanie. "Eleanor, I want to talk to you." Her voice was different now, harder and more direct than her usual polished tone. "All right," I said. "David told me you're filing some kind of legal papers tomorrow. Is that true?" "I'm filing a petition to be removed from your mortgage, yes. Because I didn't grovel enough for your taste? Because you refused to acknowledge that what you did was wrong, and because you've now threatened to keep my future grandchildren away from me if I don't submit to continued mistreatment." "I never threatened anything," Stephanie said. "I simply pointed out that actions have consequences. If you destroy our lives over something trivial, it will affect all our relationships going forward." "Stephanie, let me be very clear about something. What you did on Saturday wasn't trivial. It was cruel and calculated, and your response to being called out on that behavior has been to minimize it, refuse responsibility, and escalate to threats. You've shown me exactly who you are, and I believe you." "Who I am? You think you know who I am based on one bad day?" "I think I know who you are based on your response to criticism and your willingness to use manipulation to avoid accountability. Those are pretty fundamental character traits." Stephanie was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a cold fury that I had never heard before. "You want to know who I am, Eleanor? I'm the woman who's been putting up with your son's financial irresponsibility for 3 years. I'm the woman who's been covering for his business failures and managing our debt while he plays entrepreneur. I'm the woman who's been pretending to be grateful for your help when the truth is that your interference in our finances has been a source of constant stress." The words poured out of her like poison she had been storing for years. "You think you're this generous mother helping her son achieve his dreams? You're actually an enabler who's prevented David from facing the reality of his situation. He should have gotten a better job or started a more realistic business, but instead he gets to play around with consulting because Mommy co-signed his mortgage." I listened to her venomous rant with growing clarity about who Stephanie really was beneath her polished exterior. This wasn't someone lashing out in desperation. This was someone revealing her true feelings after years of careful concealment. "Are you finished?" I asked when she finally stopped talking. "No, I'm not finished. You want an apology for Saturday? Here's your apology. I'm sorry I didn't handle the situation better. I should have told you directly that the party wasn't for family, instead of making up excuses. But I'm not sorry for protecting an important event from potential disruption, and I'm not sorry for prioritizing my marriage and my career over your feelings." "Thank you for your honesty," I said. "You've just confirmed that I'm making the right decision." "What decision? To destroy your son's life because his wife hurt your precious feelings?" "The decision to protect myself from continued financial exposure to someone who clearly despises me and everything I represent." "Stephanie, you just told me that my help has been a source of constant stress, that I'm an enabler, and that you're not sorry for prioritizing your image over my dignity. Why would I want to remain financially entangled with someone who views me that way?" "Because David is your son, and if you do this, you'll lose him forever." "David is an adult who can make his own choices about our relationship, but I won't be blackmailed into accepting mistreatment from you. This isn't blackmail. This is reality. If you force us to sell our house, if you destroy everything we've worked for, David will never forgive you, and neither will I." "I understand that," I said. "I've weighed those consequences against the alternative of remaining financially tied to someone who treats me with contempt. I've decided I'd rather face the possibility of losing my relationship with David than guarantee continued disrespect from you." Stephanie made a sound that might have been laughter, but it held no humor. "You're going to lose more than your relationship with David. You're going to lose everything. Your son, your daughter-in-law, your future grandchildren,
All because you couldn't handle one awkward social situation like an adult. No, Stephanie, I'm going to lose those things, if I lose them, because you chose cruelty over kindness, manipulation over honesty, and threats over accountability. But at least I'll lose them with my dignity intact. Your dignity, Stephanie repeated scornfully. I hope your dignity keeps you warm when you're sitting alone in this house with no family left to care about you. She hung up without saying goodbye, leaving me alone with the echoes of her fury and the certainty that I was making the right decision. Stephanie's mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the contempt and resentment she had been harboring all along.
The woman who had seemed so perfect when David first brought her home had shown me her true nature, and it was uglier than I had imagined. I called Margaret's office and left a message confirming our 9 o'clock appointment. Then I went through my evening routine, brushing my teeth and washing my face and putting on my nightgown as if this were any other Tuesday night. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I knew that tomorrow would change everything. By this time next week, David and Stephanie would be facing the reality of losing their home. Their marriage would be tested in ways they had never experienced. And I would be learning whether the values I had tried to instill in my son were strong enough to survive his wife's influence. It wasn't the outcome I had wanted, but it was the outcome Stephanie had chosen through her behavior and her refusal to take responsibility for it. Tomorrow, the consequences of those choices would begin to unfold. I slept better that night than I had since Saturday, comforted by the knowledge that I was finally taking control of my own story instead of letting others write it for me. Margaret's office felt different that Wednesday morning, charged with the gravity of the decision I was about to make. The autumn sunlight streaming through her tall windows seemed sharper, more focused, as if the world itself understood that this day would reshape my family's future in ways we couldn't yet imagine. "Are you certain about this, Eleanor?" Margaret asked as she arranged the petition documents on her desk. "Once we file this, there's no going back quietly. The legal machinery will begin moving, and it has its own timeline." I thought about Stephanie's venomous phone call the night before, her admission that my help had been a source of constant stress, her refusal to show any genuine remorse for her behavior. "I'm certain," I said. "Stephanie showed me last night exactly who she is. I can't remain financially tied to someone who despises me." Margaret nodded and began walking me through the documents one final time. The petition was surprisingly straightforward in its language, requesting my removal as co-signer due to concerns about the primary borrower's treatment of my interests and my lack of confidence in the ongoing arrangement. It was clinical and professional, stripped of the emotional complexity that had brought us to this point. "The lender will have 30 days to respond," Margaret explained as I signed my name at the bottom of each page. "They'll contact David and Stephanie immediately to inform them of the petition and begin evaluating their ability to qualify for the loan independently. And if they can't qualify, then they'll have 90 days to either find alternative financing or list the property for sale." Margaret sealed the documents in an envelope addressed to Pacific Northwest Mortgage Services. "Eleanor, this will likely move very quickly once it starts. Are you prepared for David's reaction?" I had been asking myself the same question since deciding to move forward with the petition. Was I prepared to potentially lose my relationship with my son? Was I ready to face the possibility that Stephanie would follow through on her threats to keep my future grandchildren away from me? "I'm prepared to face whatever consequences come from protecting my dignity," I said. "I can't control how David responds, but I can control whether I continue to enable someone who treats me with contempt." Margaret walked me to her office door, her expression grave but supportive. "I'll call you as soon as we hear back from the lender. In the meantime, try to take care of yourself. This kind of family conflict is emotionally exhausting." The drive home took me through the Laurelhurst neighborhood where David and Stephanie lived.
I found myself slowing as I passed their street, wondering if they were home, if they had any sense that their world was about to change dramatically. The beautiful tree-lined avenue looked peaceful in the morning light, giving no hint of the legal storm that was about to descend on house number 2247. At home, I tried to maintain my normal routine. I graded papers for the adult literacy program where I volunteered, tended to my small garden, prepared a simple lunch, but underneath the familiar activities, I felt this strange combination of relief and anxiety that comes with making an irreversible decision. I had taken control of my situation, but I had also set in motion events that would affect people I loved. The call came sooner than expected. At 2:30 that afternoon, my phone rang with David's number on the caller ID. His voice was barely controlled, shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "What have you done?" he demanded without any greeting. "Pacific Northwest Mortgage just called. They said you filed a petition to be removed from our loan. They said we have to prove we can qualify on our own or they'll demand full payment within 90 days. "I did what I told you I would do," I said calmly. "I protected my financial interests." "You destroyed our lives is what you did." David's voice was rising, and I could hear Stephanie crying in the background. "We can't qualify for this loan on our own. You know that. We're going to lose everything because you couldn't handle one social situation like an adult." The accusation stung, but I had expected it. David was lashing out in panic and pain, and he was choosing to blame me rather than confront the reality of his wife's behavior. "David, I gave Stephanie multiple opportunities to address what she had done. She chose to escalate the situation instead of taking responsibility. These are the consequences of her choices, not mine." "Her choices?" David's voice was incredulous. "You're the one who filed legal papers. You're the one who decided to punish us financially because your feelings got hurt." "My feelings got hurt?" I repeated. "David, your wife humiliated me, lied about me, and then threatened to keep my future grandchildren away from me when I asked for accountability. This isn't about hurt feelings. This is about fundamental respect and decency." "It's about you being vindictive and cruel," David shot back. "I never thought my own mother could be so heartless." The words hit me like a physical blow, but they also clarified something important. David had completely aligned himself with Stephanie's version of events. In his mind, I was the villain, the unreasonable mother who was destroying his happiness out of spite.
David, I'm not going to argue with you about this. The legal process will move forward according to its own timeline. You and Stephanie have 90 days to figure out your options. Our options? David laughed bitterly. What options? We can't refinance. We can't come up with the cash to pay off the loan. Our only option is to sell the house and start over with nothing. Then that's what you'll do, I said. People recover from financial setbacks all the time. What's harder to recover from is the destruction of character that comes from enabling cruelty. Enabling cruelty? David's voice was getting louder. Mom, you're talking about my wife, the woman I love, the woman I'm trying to build a life with. And I'm talking about my dignity and my right to be treated with respect by people who benefit from my generosity. David, you have a choice to make here. You can work with Stephanie to rebuild your financial situation, or you can continue to blame me for the consequences of her behavior, but you can't have both. I know exactly what choice I'm making, David said, his voice turning cold. I'm choosing my wife over a mother who would destroy her own son's life out of petty revenge. The line went dead, leaving me alone with the echo of his words and the realization that the worst-case scenario was already unfolding. David had chosen Stephanie's version of reality over mine, and he was preparing to cut me out of his life rather than hold his wife accountable for her actions. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that phone call, processing the enormity of what had just happened.
In the span of 4 days, I had gone from excited grandmother-to-be planning to attend a housewarming party to estranged mother whose son viewed her as an enemy. The speed of the transformation was breathtaking and heartbreaking. But underneath the sadness, I felt something else. A quiet sense of rightness about my decision. Stephanie had shown me who she really was, and David had shown me that he was willing to enable her behavior rather than confront it. As painful as it was to lose my relationship with them, it was more painful to imagine years of continued disrespect and manipulation. The next few weeks passed in a strange limbo. Margaret called periodically with updates on the legal process, which was moving exactly as she had predicted. Pacific Northwest Mortgage had given David and Stephanie 30 days to provide documentation proving they could qualify for the loan independently. When that documentation failed to meet the lender's standards, they were giving notice that the full loan amount would be due within 60 days, unless they could arrange alternative financing. David didn't call again, but I heard about their situation through my friend Helen, whose daughter worked at the real estate agency that David and Stephanie had contacted about listing their house. According to Helen's daughter, they were hoping to sell quickly and recover enough equity to purchase a smaller home that they could afford on their own. "They seem like a nice young couple," Helen reported after running into them at the grocery store. "But they look absolutely devastated. Stephanie was crying in the cereal aisle, and David looked like he hadn't slept in weeks." Part of me wanted to reach out, to see if there was some way to repair the damage that had been done. But every time I considered calling David, I remembered Stephanie's threats about keeping future grandchildren away from me, her admission that my help had been a source of constant stress, her complete refusal to acknowledge any wrongdoing on her part. I had learned something important about both of them through this crisis, and that knowledge couldn't be unlearned. Stephanie was capable of calculated cruelty when her image was threatened, and David was willing to enable that cruelty rather than confront it. Those weren't character flaws that could be easily overcome or ignored. 3 weeks after filing the petition, I received an unexpected visitor. I was working in my garden when a car pulled into my driveway, and I looked up to see David's business partner, Marcus Webb, walking toward me. Marcus was a software engineer who went to college with David, and they had been close friends since their early 20s. "Hello, Mrs. Richardson," he said, his expression serious but not hostile. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by without calling first." "Of course not, Marcus. Would you like to come inside for coffee?" "That would be nice, thank you." Marcus had always been polite and respectful during the few times we had met, but I could see that this visit had a specific purpose. As we settled in my kitchen, he got straight to the point. "I wanted you to know that David asked me to come talk to you. He's hoping you might reconsider the mortgage situation." "What exactly did David tell you about why I filed the petition?" I asked. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He said there was a misunderstanding at their housewarming party and that things escalated from there. He said Stephanie made some social mistakes, but that you're punishing them financially for what should have been a family conversation. "That's one way to characterize it," I said. "What did Stephanie tell you about what happened?" "I haven't really talked to Stephanie about it. She's been pretty upset, and David handles most of the communication about their personal issues." I found myself in the position of deciding whether to share the full truth with someone who was essentially a stranger to the situation. But Marcus had taken the time to come here on David's behalf, and he deserved to understand what he was really being asked to mediate. So I told him everything. The deliberate exclusion from the housewarming party, Stephanie's lie about my identity, her dismissive treatment of my financial contribution to their success, her complete refusal to acknowledge any wrongdoing on her part, and finally her threats about future grandchildren and her admission that my help had been a source of constant stress. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled as the story unfolded. When he finished, he was quiet for several minutes, processing what he had heard. "That's not the version David told me," he said. "I'm sure it isn't. David has chosen to accept his wife's characterization of events rather than acknowledge what really happened. But why would Stephanie do something so deliberately hurtful? Marcus asked. That doesn't sound like the woman I've met at their dinner parties. Because she felt threatened by my presence at an event where she wanted to control the narrative about their success.
Having the mother-in-law who co-signed their mortgage there would have complicated the story she wanted to tell. Marcus rubbed his forehead, clearly struggling with the gap between what he had expected to hear and the reality I had described. Mrs. Richardson, I came here thinking I could help mediate some kind of family misunderstanding, but if what you're telling me is true, this isn't about miscommunication. This is about fundamental character issues. That's exactly right, I said. And Marcus, those character issues didn't suddenly appear on Saturday. They were always there. The housewarming party just created circumstances where they became visible. What do you mean? I think Stephanie has always resented needing my financial help to purchase their house. She's always felt that my involvement diminished their achievements somehow. Saturday gave her an opportunity to put me in my place, to make it clear that while my money was welcome, my presence was not. Marcus stared out my kitchen window at the garden Frank and I had built together over decades of partnership and mutual respect. David's going to lose his house. David's going to lose his house because his wife chose cruelty over kindness and because he chose to enable that choice rather than confront it. I didn't create this situation, Marcus. I just refused to continue enabling it. But you could stop it, Marcus said. You could withdraw the petition and give them another chance. To do what? To continue the same pattern where Stephanie treats me poorly and David makes excuses for her behavior? Marcus, this isn't about the house. This is about whether I'm going to allow myself to be treated with contempt by people who benefit from my generosity. Marcus was quiet for a long time, and I could see him reconsidering everything he thought he knew about the situation. Finally, he looked at me directly. What would it take for you to consider withdrawing the petition? I had been asking myself the same question for weeks, trying to imagine what would need to change for me to feel comfortable continuing the financial relationship with David and Stephanie. It would take Stephanie acknowledging, specifically and in detail, every cruel thing she did and why it was wrong. It would take her explaining how she plans to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. And it would take David acknowledging that he enabled her behavior by making excuses for it instead of holding her accountable. And if they did all of that, then we could talk about moving forward. But Marcus, I need you to understand that I'm not holding my breath for that kind of accountability. Stephanie has shown me that she's more committed to protecting her image than to taking responsibility for her actions. Marcus left shortly after that, promising to relay our conversation to David accurately and completely. I appreciated his effort to mediate, but I suspected that David had sent him hoping for a different outcome than the one Marcus would be reporting. 2 days later, David called. Marcus told me what you said about Stephanie, about her needing to acknowledge specific things and explain her behavior. That's right. Mom, she's not going to do that. She feels like you're asking her to humiliate herself to save our house. I'm asking her to take responsibility for her actions. If she views that as humiliation, it tells you something important about her relationship with accountability. She says she already apologized, and that asking for more than that is unreasonable. David, her apology was hollow and superficial. It showed no understanding of what she had done wrong or why it was harmful. It was designed to make the problem go away, not to address the real issues. So what are we supposed to do? We're going to lose our house in 6 weeks. The pain in David's voice was heartbreaking, but I couldn't let his suffering change my position. Stephanie had created this crisis through her behavior and her refusal to address it appropriately. You're supposed to learn from this experience and make better choices going forward. You're supposed to recognize that actions have consequences and that some consequences can't be avoided by making excuses or shifting blame. What about forgiveness, Mom?
What about grace and second chances? Didn't you teach me that families work through their problems instead of destroying each other? The question cut deep because it touched on values I had indeed tried to instill in David throughout his childhood, but it also revealed a fundamental misunderstanding about what forgiveness meant and what circumstances warranted it. David, forgiveness doesn't mean accepting continued mistreatment. Grace doesn't mean enabling cruelty. I gave Stephanie multiple opportunities to address what she had done, and she chose to escalate the situation instead. That's not someone seeking forgiveness. That's someone demanding impunity. She's my wife, David said quietly. I love her. I know you do, and I hope that love motivates you to help her become a better person instead of protecting her from the consequences of her choices. By becoming a better person, you mean doing whatever you demand? By becoming a better person, I mean developing the capacity for genuine remorse and accountability. David, those are qualities that will serve your marriage well in the long run. A relationship where one person can never admit fault and the other person enables that behavior is not sustainable. David was quiet for a long time, and I could hear him reconsidering everything he thought he knew about the situation. The house goes on the market next week, he said finally. We're hoping to close by the end of next month. I'm sorry it's come to this, I said, and I meant it. But David, this situation was created by choices Stephanie made and continues to make. I didn't want this outcome, but I won't sacrifice my dignity to avoid it. You'll never forgive me for this, David said, his voice breaking.
You're destroying my life to prove a point. I'm protecting myself from someone who has shown me contempt and disrespect. If that destroys your life, it's because your life was built on a foundation that couldn't withstand accountability. After David hung up, I walked through my house, touching the things Frank and I had collected over 4 decades of marriage. The photographs on the mantelpiece showed David at various stages of his life, as a gap-toothed 8-year-old, a proud high school graduate, a nervous groom on his wedding day. In every picture, he was surrounded by people who loved him and wanted the best for him. Somewhere along the way, that foundation of love had been compromised by someone who viewed relationships as transactions to be managed, rather than bonds to be cherished. Stephanie had turned my son against me, not through superior arguments, but through superior manipulation, convincing him that her victim status trumped my legitimate grievances. The house sold faster than anyone expected. Helen's daughter reported that David and Stephanie had accepted an offer within 2 weeks of listing, though it was below their asking price. They would lose most of their equity, but they would escape with enough to make a down payment on a smaller home in a less expensive neighborhood. I learned through the same grapevine that they had found a modest townhouse in Beaverton, about 20 minutes further from David's office, but within their reduced budget. The new mortgage would be smaller and entirely in their names, freeing me from any ongoing financial obligation. 3 months after the housewarming party that had started everything, I received a formal letter from Pacific Northwest Mortgage Services confirming that I had been removed from David and Stephanie's loan and that the debt had been satisfied through the sale of the property. It was a brief, business-like communication that marked the end of our financial entanglement and the beginning of whatever relationship, if any, we would have going forward. David didn't call to tell me about the sale or the move. I learned about their new address when my Christmas card to them was returned with a forwarding notice. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Communication that had once been easy and natural now required detective work and luck. But as the winter months passed, I found myself settling into a new kind of peace. My house was quiet, but not lonely. I had my volunteer work at the literacy center, my book club, my garden to plan for spring. I had relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than obligation and financial entanglement. Most importantly, I had my dignity intact. I hadn't allowed someone to treat me poorly just to keep peace in the family. I hadn't enabled cruelty just to maintain relationships. I had stood up for myself,
accepted the consequences, and discovered that those consequences were more manageable than I had feared. Frank would have been proud of me, I thought. He had always said that self-respect was something you had to fight for, that no one would give it to you just because you deserved it. He had raised David to have those same values, but somewhere along the way, David had forgotten them. Perhaps someday he would remember. Perhaps someday he would understand that standing up to mistreatment isn't vindictive or cruel, but necessary for maintaining the kinds of relationships worth having. Perhaps someday he would thank me for showing him that love without respect isn't really love at all. But even if that day never came, I would know that I had chosen correctly. I had chosen dignity over convenience, respect over relationship, truth over peace. In a world that often demanded compromise of basic decency, I had drawn a line and held it. It was a choice I could live with, whatever the cost. The spring flowers were beginning to bloom in my garden when I received an unexpected letter addressed in David's careful handwriting. Inside was a brief note and a photograph of a baby girl with dark hair and serious eyes. "Mom," the note read, "I wanted you to know that Emma Claire Richardson was born on March 15th. She weighs 7 pounds 2 ounces, and she's healthy and beautiful. I hope someday you'll meet her. David." I stared at the photograph for a long time, memorizing every detail of my granddaughter's face. She had David's nose and what looked like Frank's chin. She was beautiful and perfect, and she existed in a world where her grandmother was a stranger. I placed the photograph on my mantelpiece next to the pictures of David growing up. This new generation, continuing the family story even as the older connections remained broken. Maybe Emma would grow up hearing stories about her grandmother that painted me as the villain of their early marriage. Maybe she would never know about the woman who had made their first home possible. Or maybe, someday, she would ask questions that her parents couldn't answer with simple vilification. Maybe she would want to understand why her grandmother chose principle over relationship, dignity over family harmony. Maybe she would learn that some battles are worth fighting, even when the cost seems too high to bear. I hoped so, because the alternative, a world where kindness is taken for granted and cruelty is excused for the sake of keeping peace, was not a world I wanted my granddaughter to inherit. The photograph was the last communication I received from David, but it was enough. It told me that life was continuing, that new stories were being written, that love persisted even when relationships faltered, and it reminded me that the choices we make about how to treat each other echo through generations, shaping the kind of world we leave behind for the children who will inherit our victories and our failures. I had chosen to fight for dignity and respect, knowing the cost might be higher than I could afford to pay. The final accounting was still being written, but I was at peace with the choice itself. Sometimes love means saying no. Sometimes it means accepting loss rather than accepting mistreatment. Sometimes it means standing alone rather than standing compromised. These were hard lessons, but they were true ones. And truth, Frank had always said, was worth fighting for. Now, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to check out these 2 ones right on the screen, waiting for you. They're equally captivating, and you won't want to miss them. Just click on one of them.